So I know I only have a few minutes.
That's okay.
So I want to get right to it. I've been meaning to ask you this. You know, Congressman Gowdy, he's one of our home congressmen. Mm-hmm. Do you think he's treating you fairly in the Benghazi inquiry?
I think that's for other people to judge. I mean, he has to be judged by first his constituents and the people of South Carolina about what he's doing. All I can say is that there were numerous prior investigations in both the House and the Senate led by Republicans and Democrats. There was an independent investigation, and the questions have been answered. So he'll have to decide where he goes from here.
Wanted to ask you about the trade deal. It's in the news lately, and 1 in 5 jobs in South Carolina depend on exports.
Right.
Curious where you stand on it. Do you support President's position?
What I have said is that I will judge the final agreement, because we don't know what's in it yet. It has not been fully negotiated. And if it's a good deal for America, if it promotes jobs and exports and protects our national security, that's the standards by which I will judge it. Once the House Democrats put a stop to it on Friday, I suggested that the president listen to their concerns, sort through what is fair and legitimate, and where possible, try to respond to those. And I don't know what the outcome will be, but it'll either go forward on the process issue, the Trade Promotion Authority, or not. But the negotiation to get the agreement still has a ways to go, and I will judge that on what it says finally.
Do you support the fast-tracking provision?
You know, I didn't take a position on it because it's a process issue. I mean, you know, it's a convenience for an administration. When I was in the Senate, I voted against fast-track authority for then President Bush. I have voted for trade agreements that I thought were in the country's interests, and I voted against trade agreements that I thought were not. So I like to stay focused on what's in the agreement. I think that's the most important consideration you have to make.
Wanted to ask you about Senator Lindsey Graham and a position that both of you have supported in the past, and that is when President Obama called for limited airstrikes in Syria at the end of 2013. Lindsey Graham, who's also running for president, looks back at that moment and says, you know, we didn't do that. We were backing it, we didn't do it, and now we have ISIS. So to South Carolina, a big military state, what would you say to our voters here? What do you think we should do about ISIS?
Well, first of all, I think that removing the chemical weapons from Syria, which took both U.S. and Russian cooperation to force the Assad regime to give up those chemical weapons, was a significant step forward. It was important not only for the people of Syria, but the people of Lebanon, the people of Israel, the people of Jordan, and the broader area. So although I did think that action had to be taken, when the president took another approach and the chemical weapons were removed, that was a positive step. I don't think you can draw any kind of straight line between, you know, whether or not something happened in Syria to ISIS. I think the line that can be drawn is ISIS, in large measure, is fueled by anger and disaffection from Sunni Iraqis with the government of Maliki, with Shiite dominance, with the role of Iran, all of which did not have to happen if the Maliki government had fulfilled the commitments it made to its own people and to the United States and other countries. I think that's what gave the space that enabled what had been al-Qaeda in Iraq to morph into ISIS. And now we have to deal with it as it is, because it presents a threat to the region, but it also presents a more global threat. And so I am very much in the camp that said, you know, we need to do what the president is doing now, and we need to do more to get the Iraqis themselves to push ISIS out. We're seeing some, you know, better efforts between the Kurds, their Peshmerga forces, and some of the Iraqi army units, and hopefully the approach to get the Sunni Arabs in Iraq back into the fight. They should never have been disbanded by the Maliki government. So now we have to recreate what we left Maliki and what he unfortunately destroyed.
Do you think it's going to take more troops, more boots on the ground of American soldiers in combat to clean that up?
I do not think it would be smart, effective, or appropriate for us to put ground troops into Iraq. I do think, as the president is now pursuing, there's a role for air power, there's a role for intelligence and surveillance, there's a role for training. There are specific roles that our military is playing and can successfully play in better focusing the Iraqis themselves on what they have to do, because eventually this will be won or lost by the people in the region. They're going to have to decide, do they want to be oppressed and subjected by this regime of terrorism and give up their right to govern themselves to this group? They have to decide that. So I'm in favor of the steps that the president has taken, and I think we have to accelerate them and do as much as we can as quickly as possible to try to build up the Iraqi forces.
If, depending on how the Supreme Court rules on the health care subsidies, 100,000 people in South Carolina could lose their insurance.
Right.
And we didn't exactly buy into that program.
Right.
If you're president, what do you tell those 100,000 South Carolinians who might lose their insurance?
Well, the crisis, if it comes, will come long before I'm president, and it's 16 million people nationwide. I'm not going to speculate on what the court does. I learned a long time ago that's hard to predict. And I hope that the court will follow the spirit and the impact of their reading of the law to affirm the right of states and the federal government to offer policies. And we won't have to face this, because I have said I will defend the Affordable Care Act. I think it has been a great service to these 16 million people, 100,000 in South Carolina. I regret that South Carolina has refused to extend Medicaid, because I know what a difference that's making in many states that chose to do that. So I will wait to see what the court decides, but clearly if they affirm the Affordable Care Act, there's still work to be done, because we do have some challenges that have to be addressed. If they cut a big hole in it, then we have to figure out how to protect the health care that these 16 million people have gotten. And in South Carolina, I bet of those 100,000 people, it could be just the most terrible, disruptive experience to be told you no longer have the policy you signed up for, the policy you're paying, the doctors under that policy that are taking care of you, for everybody, but particularly for people with chronic conditions that need continuity of care. And I don't know what the Republicans are going to do, because the Republicans were behind bringing this suit. They're going to have to look in the eyes of people who are dependent on the health care they're now getting. And you tell them to explain what they're going to do to help.
I mean, but do you think if you become president, the fight is definitely not over? I know it's not over for them either, but in terms of getting those, reinstating the subsidies in some way, is there some legal maneuver that
we have,
could be done?
But we have to wait and see. I'm not going to speculate on, I mean, there are many ways to decide this. I'm not going to speculate on what the court will do. I will be ready with a statement about what I think should be done once the court has made up its mind. But the point I want to stress is, even if the court does what I think it should do, which is to interpret the plain meaning of the law, there are still going to be issues with the Affordable Care Act and with the refusal of states like South Carolina to expand Medicaid, and the fact that because of the refusal to expand Medicaid, rural hospitals are closing, and all of the other consequences. And I will have to address those as president.
wanted to ask you about Congressman Clyburn. You know, I read the beginning of his autobiography. It starts with a phone call from former President Clinton. Has there been a reconciling between you and Congressman Clyburn, or what's your relationship like with him?
There was never a breach as far as I was concerned. I mean, he had every right to support whomever he chose. This was a historic campaign with 2 historic candidacies, and I have a good relationship with him. I did before, I do again. I don't see any lasting challenge at all. I think we're going to work together. I look forward to his advice and support in this upcoming campaign. And as president, I would look to him in dealing with the Congress and trying to get what we can done for South Carolina and America.
South Carolina hasn't nominated, we haven't gone for the Democrat in a long time. So I'm curious, as you go around the state and campaign, what are you telling South Carolina voters, and do you think that your candidacy, being, the historic nature that it is, do you think you have an edge with Republicans in our state? I
hope so. I hope so. I'm going to find out. I think a lot of what I'm advocating in this campaign, like today at Trident Tech, I am advocating to move from what is a promising program in South Carolina to provide apprenticeships for high school students in concert with businesses, chambers of commerce, tech colleges like Trident, to a national program to provide a $1,500 tax credit to employers that see the benefit of apprenticeship programs. So I'm looking for good ideas everywhere, and I don't think I'm easily buttonholed or categorized. If I find a good idea in South Carolina championed by Republicans that I think will work, I want to point that out, and that's what I did today.
With Senator Tim Scott and his support for the
Tim Scott and Cory Booker, but also the South Carolina does have incentives, financial incentives for employers. So it's a program that I came across and thought it really made sense. And you've got a Republican governor, you've got a Republican legislature, so here's a program that, as someone running to be the Democratic nominee and a president for the entire country, I'm going to look for what works, and then I'm going to, add them to my campaign. And I think it is promising that in the Senate, as I said, you've got your Senator Tim Scott working with the New Jersey Senator Cory Booker in a bipartisan effort to try to, expand apprenticeships. And then there's another bill with another Republican and Democrat. That's how we get things done in this country, and that's what I want to be part of.
How the tax credits that you've talked about, with all the talk of budget cuts, how do you pay for something like that to put enough money toward it to make it truly meaningful and impactful?
Well, I'll be rolling out my agenda over the next weeks, and I'm very conscious of the need to both make smart investments, as I believe apprenticeships are, in future jobs for young people, but to do so in a fiscally responsible way. It was my husband's administration and his leadership that ended up with a balanced budget and a surplus, and I watched that be totally dismantled as a senator under the Republicans, who just turned their back on the idea that if we had kept on that path of a balanced budget with a surplus, we would have paid off the national debt. After 9/11, with 2 wars, instead of paying for it by our own tax revenues, the Republicans borrowed money from foreign countries to pay for wars and reconstructing our country after 9/11. That is not responsible in my view. So I will lay out what I think should be done and what we have to do to try to pay for it, but I believe in investments. And I think right now we're at a critical juncture. We're cutting back on research and development. We're losing our lead. We're cutting back on innovation across the board in our economy. We're cutting back on infrastructure. We're not even fixing our roads and our bridges. You can't be a great economy, let alone a great country, if you don't make investments for tomorrow. So I'll make that case. Voters will get to decide.
Does that involve raising taxes? I mean, we're dealing with a sequestration that, Congress can't seem to fully get passed.
Well, I think you have to lay out what your agenda is and then tell people how you would pay for it. And I will do that. I'm not going to, preview it now because we got a lot of work that we're doing that will kind of put the pieces together. But you don't, our country paid its way for a long time. When my husband became president, the prior 3 terms, 2 terms of President Reagan, 1 term of the first President Bush, quadrupled the debt of the country, okay? So if you're someone like my husband and I are, who come from hardworking middle-class families who believe that, yeah, maybe you go into debt to buy a house and then you work like crazy to pay for it, you make investments, but you also do it in a responsible way. What Bill did was to come up with an economic approach that complied with arithmetic. You can't spend money on anything that you don't have, because if you look at the way the Republicans have spent for the last 35 years, they have in many ways put our country in a fiscally negative position. And I saw it as First Lady coming in and seeing what my husband inherited, and I saw it in the Senate as I watched the dismantling of responsible fiscal policies, and I saw it as Secretary of State when I saw the Great Recession that President Obama had inherited. So I'm ready to go toe-to-toe with anybody about what's a responsible way to put our country on the right track to be strong, prosperous, secure, filled with opportunity for people willing to work for it.
You've been in a high-profile position for, more than 2 decades, and everyone pretty much knows you who's paying attention. But you're sort of reintroducing yourself in South Carolina. You have a message of how you spent time here early in your career. Do you find it difficult to sort of redefine yourself? And if you don't mind, I want to just tell you something. I wrote a story for today's paper about how you might appeal to women and how that might be different than how Obama appealed to Democratic voters. And one woman I was talking to said, well, it's not going to be the same. And I said, why? And she said, well, because she's a Clinton. And so you're a known quantity to her, I suppose, at least in her mind. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I am the same person I've always been, and I care about the same things I've always cared about, and I've worked on the same issues and concerns for a really long time. And I think it's good to remind people who are new and young and haven't been following politics for decades where I come from, who I am, what I care about, and so I will keep doing that. And I will leave it to the voters to make up their own mind. You can vote for or against somebody on any basis that you choose. That's our democracy. But I think when it's all said and done, I will present the best alternative for the kind of country that I think most Americans want for their children and grandchildren. And as a grandmother now, I take that very seriously. So thanks.
The time you spent in South Carolina, is there any sort of formative moment that you feel like shaped your career or your direction or the way you thought about even the South and the challenges facing it?
Well, my first job, as I said out there, was for Marian Wright Edelman with the Children's Defense Fund, and she was South Carolina born and bred, and I learned a lot from her, and I learned a lot about what motivated her, and I found that incredibly instructive. And one of my first assignments working for the Children's Defense Fund was to come down to South Carolina and gather information about the incarceration of juveniles with adults, which was a problem we were looking at nationwide, and people in South Carolina had asked the Children's Defense Fund to come and study that problem here, and I did that. And I met a lot of really good people and hardworking people who cared about what happened to kids. Dick Riley was a good friend of my husband's and mine. Fritz Hollings was somebody that I admired both as a governor and a senator. So I have a lot of relationships and friendships that influence how I think about South Carolina. And I'm looking forward to traveling around the state and campaigning hard. So thank you.